Hello everybody and welcome to this talk which is entitled Making Historical Maps, and it's a talk from the Historic Towns Trust, which is a charity that makes maps and atlases of historic British towns. Just to introduce myself, my name is Giles Darkes and I'm a cartographic editor, and I help out with producing the maps that the Trust publishes. And I hope that this talk will explain what we do in terms of making our maps, and also may give you some tips if you're making your own historical maps. Well, let's just start off by defining what we mean by a historical map. On the left-hand side we have a map of Swansea of about 200 years ago, and that can be described as a historic map. But on the right-hand side we have a historical map, that's to say a modern map, but it shows some aspects of history, and in this case it's a map showing the plan or projected plan of the medieval castle and some of the layout of the medieval town. So a historical map is a modern map but showing some aspect of history. Here we have a couple of examples which may help to explain what we mean by a thematic map, because historical maps are essentially thematic maps. On the left-hand side we have a thematic map that clearly isn't historical, but it shows that a thematic map is made up of a background of topographical information, and here we have a minimal amount of information, just really coastline and country outlines, but the theme is shown superimposed onto that, and the topographical information gives it context. On the right-hand side we have a historical map, but again it has a very simple topographical information, topographical background to it, which allows you to see the historical theme in context. In the Historic Towns Trust we tend to use Ordnance Survey maps of the late 19th and early 20th century, which form the background information for us to add the historical information. And in this case we have an extract from the 1910 1 to 2500 map of Beverley in the East Riding of Yorkshire. And you'll see that we've credited the National Library of Scotland here as being the source of this map. If you're making your own historical maps, then you'll find that the digitised map resources created by the NLS are very, very useful to you, and often a good point at which to start. Well, this base map is taken and then we undertake what is called vector digitizing. That's to say, converting all the outlines of buildings and other sites of interest into lines. And you can see this is the result, which is not a very interesting map, but once you start to add the symbology to it, the vector raw data is then taken and we add suitable colours to denote buildings of different dates and to show sites of particular interest. And then the final thing that we add to it is the text, which sits on the highest visual layer, so that's to say in front of all the other information, and that is what actually gives meaning to the map. In this case we have another example of an Ordnance Survey map that has been used to construct a historical map. This is from York and it's an extract from the large-scale survey of York undertaken by the Ordnance Survey about 1850 and published in 1852, showing the west end of York Minster and part of the surrounding area and streets. So this map was digitised and then historical information superimposed onto it, and you can see here the sites of lost medieval buildings and also lost post-medieval buildings. In the case of Hull and also Bristol, we have used a slightly different approach. In the case of Hull, you can see that we have used in the background a facsimile Ordnance Survey map of the 1920s, and then the historical information has been superimposed on it and labels added to give meaning to it. And this is a relatively cost-effective way of producing a historical map. If you're going to reproduce this map facsimile, then you need to actually pay royalties to the owner of the base map. In the case of Bristol in 1480, here we are reconstructing the city as it appeared around that time from the writings of a man called William Worcester. And here you can see, again faded out in the background, the Ordnance Survey map that we used, and then that information reconstructed from Worcester's very extensive and detailed writings, reconstructed and put on top of the Ordnance Survey map, which gives it context and meaning. In the case of most of our maps, we undertake vector digitizing, and here is the map of Canterbury, the historical map, the full sheet. But if we zoom in to the legend, then you can see here the sort of categories of building and sites of interest that we show. The top three entries here show the sites of post-medieval buildings, either standing or disappeared at the date of the base map. And the next three entries, the solid gold downwards, show the sites of major medieval buildings, again either standing or disappeared. And in many towns we use the Reformation, about 1540, as the dividing line between medieval and post-medieval, although that does vary according to the town and its location within Great Britain. Zooming into part of that same map of Canterbury, you can see how a very complicated, complex area, in this case around St. Augustine's Abbey, comes out on the map. And it has to be said that this is probably at about the limit of graphical clarity. That's to say, if we added any more information to it, it would be very difficult for the reader to interpret it. But this shows how a multi-period map can depict sites of interest from the Roman. In the background we have a Roman cemetery, burial area, right up through the Anglo-Saxon, the medieval, the post-medieval, and up to the early modern in terms of an industrial building with the malt house. What about sources of information? Well, if you have access to archaeological plans, then they can of course be very, very useful to you. Do be aware though that many archaeological plans often consist of a mixture of what was actually found and reconstruction or conjecture, and so you may perhaps have to treat it with a degree of caution. But if you can combine an archaeological plan with extant remains, and in this case we have the gatehouse of Alnwick Abbey, whose plan was shown in the previous slide, then you can then add that information to the map, and here we have that plan of Alnwick Abbey, and you can see the distinction we've made between the surviving gatehouse and the lost abbey buildings. Well, historic maps can themselves of course be very useful sources of information, and in the case of Alnwick we were able to use this very careful detailed architect's plan of the First World War army camp erected in the Castle Park in Alnwick, and add that to our map, and we were able to show exactly the location of those buildings, almost all of which have long since gone. And in the case of Alnmouth, just down the road, the course of the river has changed historically. This tithe map of 1843 shows its former course as well as its course in 1843. And we were able to add that onto our historical map to show where the river course had been previously. Here we have a nice example of a useful historic map on the left-hand side to acting as a source of information, in this case for the new jail, the town jail in Cambridge, and we were able to corroborate from other sources that this was indeed its site and also its plans, so we were able to add it to our map. But do be aware that many historic maps actually contain information which needs checking or corroborating from other sources. So from that same source map you can see on the right hand side Barnwell New Church. Well, there's no evidence that that church was ever built. So do beware that something that appears on an old map may not actually ever have existed, or indeed it may not have been in the place shown on the map. How do you deal with uncertainty? Well, in this case, again, we have an extract from the forthcoming historical map of Cambridge. We know that part of the Dominican friary, namely its church, became the hall of Emmanuel College after the Reformation, but we know very little about the form of the other buildings. And so you can see from this example how we've used a combination of solid lines and pecked or dashed lines to indicate the degree of certainty or uncertainty that we have about where those buildings were. And this is a perfectly reasonable approach. And in the case of Coventry, you can see from the example here that not only have we used symbols which denote this uncertainty in terms of the pecked outlines, but also we've added question marks to the labels to indicate that not only are we uncertain about the site, but also about the use of some of those buildings. How do you go about presenting your information? Well, here we have a very nice example of a local historical map. I probably wouldn't have used this colour scheme myself, but I think it looks really clear. It's very easy to understand the different categories of information shown, and I think that the audience would find this quite easy to interpret. If you're restricted to just black and white, don't despair, because by the use of appropriate symbols and hatching and also appropriate labels, then a black and white map can also be just as clear as a coloured map. Well, let's finish up with an extract from a forthcoming map. This is the map of Cambridge, which shows how a multi-period map can appear. And you can see the same sort of categories of information shown on that map of Canterbury here, the medieval, the post-medieval, and also one or two others as well. For example, the medieval names of streets, and also buildings that have long disappeared, for example, the almshouses that were there. And with careful design, you can have a lot of complicated information shown on a historical map. Well, I hope that's been of use to you. For further information about what we do have a look at our website. You can get free access to the early British Historic Towns Atlas volumes. And I'd like to finish by saying good luck with your own historical mapping.